Hello and welcome to Herodotus, a podcast series where we will examine historical events of our interest. My name is Daisy, I'm the host of the show today, and with me to discuss world history is my good friend Sadhana.
Hello.
Each episode, we will talk about one event in history that has shaped our world, from the monarchs to the art and to the many wars. Today, we will be talking about an event that has largely been obscured until the 2000s. So, Sahana, tell me about Operation Condor.
So, Operation Condor was a secretive campaign coordinated by several South American rulers to eliminate their political opponents. It was responsible for copious, and I quote, extra legal arrests, extraditions, and other human rights abuses. As of today, there are 736 recorded cases of kidnap, torture, rape, and even murder, according to the database on South America's transnational human rights violations.
So, what countries were part of this operation?
There were 8 South American military dictatorships: Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Bolivia, Paraguay, Brazil, Peru, and Ecuador. They formed into a single network that covered 4/5 of the continent. They sent death squads onto each other's territory to kidnap, murder, and torture enemies among their immigrant and exile communities. Now, these were the nations that were recognized at that time for their participation in Operation Condor. The United States was revealed later to have been involved in operations and in general support.
And what is the cause of this?
Question. The Cold War was ensuing from tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union at this time. This tension spread and enveloped other nations as state affairs were either overlooked by the US or the USSR. There was a widespread fear concerning the Soviet threat, specifically the spread of communism and extreme ideals. As Soviet actions escalated, left wing groups were seen as threats. These series of events primarily influenced right wing coups to form and target not only left wing groups, but also left wing sympathizers.
So, Operation Condor was a reflex to communism.
Yes, that's one way to put it.
And while we're on the topic of left wing ideals, can you explain the difference between communism and socialism?
So, communism is a far left ideology that involves the creation of an equal society through an authoritarian regime, while socialism is compatible with democracy and liberties.
Okay, so what was the result of the operation?
Operation Condor heavily relied on instilling fear and terror. Kidnappings and other violent acts served as warnings for others. And as this terror traveled across Southern America, less and less left wing groups rebelled, and the successes of the right wing military coups piled up on top of each other. These successes demonstrated the successful eradication of communist threat, but also potential uprisings.
But it was actually really damaging to Latin America, wasn't it?
That's right. These right wing coups also erased traces and even seeds of democracy. And ironically enough, the United States, a nation built upon democratic ideologies that strive to encourage democracy during the Cold War, often supported these practices. Hundreds of victims were secretly disposed of. Some of them were tossed into the sea from planes or helicopters after being made immobile by being tied up, shackled to concrete blocks, or even drugged. And in addition, Paraguay served as a refuge for a number of international fugitives, including Nazi war criminal Joseph Mengele.
Okay, so what is the United States part in this?
U.S. military groups and intelligence services saw Operation Condor as a counterterror organization. For the U.S., Latin America was a Cold War battlefield, and Operation Condor was their primary weapon. Not surprisingly, those who participated in military operations on behalf of the U.S. graduated from the U.S. Army School of the Americas. It was surprising, however, that these men were willing to heed on orders that ignore the immoral acts committed under Operation Condor. And when you step back from the situation, you can see the extent to which the Cold War influenced America's goals regarding Operation Condor. Latin America faced a political and economic evolution during the Cold War era as a number of military dictatorships steadily rose. The US saw this as an effect of the Soviet threat, as well as an opportunity to fulfill their Cold War interest. While many historians agree with this idea, others have argued that US interventions in Latin America did not revolve around the Soviet threat or other Cold War interests. Several cables and documents have supported US involvement in Operation Condor. However, the debate surrounding this topic still continues. Details surrounding US involvement are yet to be revealed, and not to mention that a majority of the discovered cables are heavily redacted.
And what about Europe? What role did they play in the operation?
In fact, a heavily redacted CIA cable from September 1977 recorded that, and I quote, visit of representatives of West German, French, and British intelligence services to Argentina to discuss methods for establishment of an anti-subversive organization similar to Condor. So you can see there was no general feeling that the operation should be stopped.
So how did the operation end?
It was not sudden for sure. As the dictatorships fell one by one, attacks and other measures appeared less frequently. Attempts to prosecute Condor abusers or those who were heavily involved with military operations were non existent or even weak. The consequences of rebelling were made clear during the prime of Operation Condor, so it can be understood that people were afraid to rebel in fear of the rebirth of a totalitarian regime. Nevertheless, Argentina's former junta leaders were tried and accused of human rights abuses in 1985. While amnesties proved as challenges to call for justice, by 2011, most of these policies were removed and allowed for proper investigation.
So tell me more about the investigation.
The first major criminal investigation on Condor began in Rome more than 20 years ago with victims and defendants from 7 countries. It still has not ended, though. And as I mentioned before, investigations now are freed from the restraints of amnesties and other imposing laws. Unfortunately, trials tend to carry on for long periods, such as the case for many Condor cases. Many survivors and victims have shared their concern about the legal process concerning Operation Condor, while smaller cases have helped Condor victims share their stories in court. Given the scale and lasting effects of the program, not much has been really done.
Thank you, Sadhana. When we come back, we will discuss the lack of awareness on Operation Condor. But first, here's a reminder to subscribe to our podcast where we explore a broad range of historical events from unique perspectives. In the last episode of our sister show, Twin Tours, our good friend Sue took a look at the cases of silent twins, where the twins became obsessed with each other. And on Talking Tang, Joy and I discuss all aspects of China's Tang dynasty. Welcome back. Before our break, we were discussing operation investigations and court cases. Operation Condor started off as a secretive program hidden from public knowledge, and while cables have revealed the atrocities that were committed under a different name, public awareness still appears low.
So, as you might have gathered, Operation Condor is not widely known to the general public. It is largely confined within the scholarly community, despite many of its victims speaking up and sharing their stories.
So this understanding begs the question, how do we know what's the truth? Or better yet, what is the role of truth in the realms of historical knowledge?
That's an excellent but difficult question. You have to consider the various factors that were at play during that time. The US wanted to preserve democracy and halt the spread of communism. The Soviet threat was peaking, and as the world witnessed nation after nation succumbing to communist rule, there was a need for drastic measures. So, to keep Latin America safe from Soviet grasp, the US turned to Operation Condor. And as we know, the method used under the program contradicted fundamental democratic ideals. Public awareness was also suppressed. And was this wrong? Perhaps. You can only imagine the uproar that would have ensued if operation methods were revealed. In the realms of history, bias will always follow truth, and you need to trust your facts, but you shouldn't ignore contextual cues or partialities towards reasons.
Right. When historians first discovered the CIA cables, they had to trust their resources while remaining objective. While it appears paradoxical, an element of trust was needed to make sure that the truth was revealed and spread. And this is a great time to remind our listeners to make sure that the resources you are taking information from is credible and unbiased, though biases do slip into basically everything these days. And even though Operation Condor took place more than 40 years ago, it is important that truth is uncovered and spread. The idea of history repeating itself is a common theme found in both reality and literature. The eerie similarities between the Salem witch trials of the 1690s and the McCarthy hearings of the 1950s prove this idea. It is important that historians continue to review the truths regarding Operation Condor. It is more important that the public is made aware of these discoveries. As painful as it may be to bring back past horrors to the present, it is essential that mistakes are not repeated. Operation Condor has taught us about the dangers of ignoring basic freedoms and democratic ideologies, and that lesson should not be forgotten with time. But on a more general note, what significance does the remnants of Operation Condor hold today, particularly in Latin America?
So there are still several Condor survivors and victims who still carry their stories in Latin America. Those leftover and shattered pieces of the past are undoubtedly painful memories to look back at. And as you mentioned before, Operation Condor has taught us about the dangers of ignoring basic freedoms and democratic ideologies. So, in general, its significance lies with historical truth, public deception, but also Latin American freedoms.
Thank you for potting with me, Sahana, and thank you so much to our listeners for tuning into this week's episode. Be sure to check back for our next release, where we will talk about the war that inspired the popular television series Game of Thrones, though I do believe the books are better. Our podcast is self produced, and this episode is edited by Boza. If you want to support us, we accept donations up to $1 billion.